Ever wondered what it's really going to take to reach net zero? What if cities could clean the air instead of polluting it? And could microbes hold the key to repairing the planet? Welcome to Future Now, the brand new climate innovation podcast brought to you by Springwise, the global innovation platform. The next big climate solution is out there. You just might not have heard of it yet. Join myself, Matilda Cox, and Springwise's commissioning editor Matt Hempstead, along with a host of special guests, where we'll be exploring the bold ideas, breakthrough technologies, and big questions shaping a sustainable future. Just search Future Now on your usual podcasting platform and subscribe for a monthly dose of the innovation that matters.
Hello and welcome to COP30 Covered, the daily podcast show from the award-winning Edie editorial team, in which we bring you all the latest news and views from the UN's 2025 Climate Summit, taking place now in Brazil. How much money has been pledged to the Tropical Forest Forever facility? Are countries still fighting about loss and damage? And has anyone spotted Prince Harry's private jet? We explain all in 45 minutes or less per episode. Yes, this is episode 3 of COP30 Covered from Edie, and you're listening to the voice of Edie's content editor Sarah George on Monday the 10th of November 2025. Joining me in the studio are our editor Matt Mace.
Hello.
Our senior reporter Siddy Mittal.
Hello.
And also joining us is Springwise's commissioning editor for the first time, Matthew Hempstead. Welcome, Matthew.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
Nice to have you. For the listeners' benefit, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, so I'm commissioning editor for Springwise. We became part of Faversham House last October, so just a little bit over a year ago now, and we focus on positive impact innovation, and we have a database full of solutions that have a positive impact for the planet.
Great, so we've got Matthew and team on to essentially illustrate some of the big COP themes and look at what's already happening on the ground to turn them into action. But before we get to that point, I did just want to recap on how everyone's been, how COP's been treating them so far. Matt, how are you holding up?
I am good. It is very, very cold and rainy in the UK. So whilst my accommodation at home is fine, unlike what it would have been in Brazil, the weather does make me kind of regret not being out there a little bit. But I am doing just as well as I did when I was out in Dubai, because I haven't come down with an illness that's quarantined me yet. So far, so good.
Okay, please don't say yeah, I won't be accepting it this year. And I will say that on the weather front, I've heard from people that are in Belém that it's about 80% humidity. So it might sound nice, but it's a sticky time out there. And Siri, how has your first COP weekend been?
I mean, a lot has happened, although it was like we'd expect the weekend to be a bit quieter, but stuff was still happening. I wasn't on desk this weekend. I think somebody else was from the team. But yeah, a lot's happened. One of the things is the Alliance of Small Island States, the AOSIS, have tabled a new agenda trying to compel nations to update their NDCs before the COP is over. Mm-hmm. And I think NDCs have just been a big issue this COP already, because out of all the members, only 66 NDCs have been updated so far. And we have repeatedly heard that that's nowhere enough where NDCs need to be. So that's happened. And then some mayors have made headlines, but speaking of mayors making headlines, we also saw at the Local Leaders Summit, which convened dozens of mayors from across the world, promised to make the economic and social benefits of low carbon transition clear to their residents. And this is something that I've been working on quite a lot today. Mm-hmm. We're just talking about how important it is to make climate adaptation and resilience connect with people on a day-to-day basis as well. The mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, said this moment is a turning point for our planet and our people, and from Rio to Belém, local leaders are showing that hope is not a promise, it is a plan. Kind of the mindset that I'm going with as well this week and the next.
You did well to remember that quote off by heart.
No, it's right there in front of my screen. I don't have
it's
that
the
sharp
spirit
memory,
of Anne.
but
She's just with us.
No, I'm channeling her. But yeah, so I think a lot's happened this weekend, and we're coming into a very agenda-packed week as well. I think in the last episode we mentioned there are at least like 12 agendas that will be discussed in the next 4 days. So, a lot happening.
Yeah, there's a lot happening, and we're starting to see our sort of first big declarations and first numbers. So we briefly mentioned that the Tropical Forests Forever facility has its first funders, and we've also had new side announcements on food security and poverty alleviation, and we'll be publishing a news in brief summary on all of this at the end of the day as it comes. In the meantime, the good people over at the GSCC network have been looking at social media hype in the lead up to the COP. They analysed 27,000 posts on social media on Sunday. So it's gone down week on week, and it's down year on year as well. And they found that most of the posts were either climate denying or calling out hypocrisy for the summit. So asking, why are people going there on private jets? Why are people going to a place that you need to get cruise ships into, etc., etc.? So that is to say that everyone that's there today has a narrative job on their hand, even though the weekend hasn't been quiet. And Siddy's mentioned that there's lots of themes for each pair of days at this COP, and the themes for today and tomorrow are officially, I'm taking a deep breath here, adaptation, cities, infrastructure, water, waste, local governments, the bioeconomy, the circular economy, and tourism. We obviously can't do all of these themes justice in around 35 minutes, so we're going to stick with adaptation today. I say stick with as if that in and of itself can be done in 30 minutes, when the reality is this is a really complex topic. It's linked to most of the others.
Well, we covered tourism because we've given Matthew the tour of the podcast studio. So.
Yes.
Yes, and what a tour it is.
You've never been here before.
No.
I would have loved to have an extra day to do that, because it is fascinating and it's such a big part of Brazil's economy and the economy for a lot of South American countries, but such is life. On adaptation, though, the UN did put out a big report on this last week, the Adaptation Gap Report, to set the scenes. So Matt, can you fill us in on top headlines from that report?
Yep, so I mean, we have known for a long time now that the gap between what is provided in terms of public finance for climate adaptation between what is needed is just this big chasm that seems to be widening every year. So for the latest UN report, wealthy nations provided, I think it was around $26 billion of public finance for adaptation. That's actually down from last year, which is a worrying trend, considering, was it last year where the big adaptation and resiliency piece came in from COP, or was that the year before? Year before.
Yeah.
But the fact it's come down year on year is relatively worrying. Developing countries still need $310 billion in adaptation finance annually by 2035, and the needs, given how weak the current ambitions are, could even reach $365 billion. So quite worrying the terms of what's provided and what's needed. And looking at private finance, which was at $5 billion provided for adaptation in 2023, the UN has put the necessary price at $50 billion per year from 2035 if possible. So that gap really has to be closed pretty soon, and the discussions around COP will need to be kind of focusing on how to mobilise public and private finance towards something that I think is at least being spoken about much more now than it was 2 years ago. So if there's any silver lining on it, it's that people are much more aware of climate adaptation and what it looks like in practice. Now it's unlocking it.
Yeah, it's just a shame that it's taken like the actual physical reality to bite to get there. Obviously, we're talking literally less than 2 weeks after the devastation in Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think this is front of minds for a lot of people. And I wanted to come to you, Matthew, to look at sort of where that private finance and philanthropic finance has been going in recent years. What sort of climate adaptation solutions and innovations are really getting people's attention at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, just to start by talking about the impact of its financing if it were there. So in June this year, the World Resources Institute found that every dollar invested in adaptation and resilience generates more than $10 in benefits over 10 years. So just to reiterate, it's definitely a good thing to do. And then just in terms of like our little world of Springwise, where we look at venture capital, we do see some slight growing momentum in climate adaptation, and not a whole lot. When we look at venture capital last year, PwC found that climate adaptation and resilience featured in 28% of climate tech deals in the first 3 quarters of 2024. Now, those are obviously slightly out of date figures because we're coming up to the time of year when those kind of annual retrospectives are published. So it'll be interesting to see if there has been an uptick in 2025. But in terms of the areas where we're seeing interesting solutions, both at the startup and at kind of the research level, I mean, a really important one for us is clean cooling. So according to the International Energy Agency, space cooling is the fastest growing source of energy demand from the building sector, and that is due to a combination of factors. So first, there's the economic demographic shift where middle class households in hot countries in the developing world are beginning to be able to afford aircon for the first time. At the same time, we're seeing more frequent and intense extreme heat events. So of the people who already have aircon units, they're using them more often and for longer. And third, countries, we talked about how rainy it is in the UK, but recently in the summer it's been getting hotter. So there's also the third factor of countries that typically didn't have aircon installing cooling units for the first time. So as a result, we're seeing what a lot of people are calling the cooling paradox, which is where, we need to cool down, so we use more energy intensive cooling solutions. So that's actually going to be kind of a bigger problem in terms of energy demand growth than AI data centers, depending on some of the things that you look at. So all that is to say that we are seeing a kind of focus on clean cooling solutions, and we kind of see 3 key trends in our database. So first, we are seeing kind of add-ons and design refinements to kind of traditional aircon systems. So in very humid countries, for example, we talked about the humidity in Brazil. A lot of the energy consumed by aircon units is actually spent on dehumidifying the air. So we're seeing kind of bolt-on technologies that kind of more efficiently, to use a non-technical phrase, pre-dry the air going into the unit, which delivers a kind of significant energy saving. So we have a really good example of this is Helix Earth, which is a US startup that created one of these devices that can be easily retrofitted onto commercial rooftop AC units. Second, we're seeing innovators that are kind of creating cooling systems based on solid state cooling. So that's essentially takes advantage of intrinsic properties of special types of solid material rather than using kind of fluid refrigerants. So a really good example of this is Magnatherm in Germany. They're a startup that develops cooling systems that take advantage of the fact that certain materials change temperature when they're subject to a magnetic field. So you can actually create a cooling loop that way. And finally, we're seeing kind of passive cooling technologies and what they are essentially things that you can add to the built environment to have a cooling effect without any kind of additional external energy input. So radiative cooling is a very interesting example that we did a deep dive on earlier this year, and essentially, to grossly simplify something quite complicated, it essentially reflects incoming sunlight while also emitting heat from within a building or an object into space. So those kind of clean cooling innovations are very interesting. We've known for a long time urban greening also has a really important role to play, and we're sort of seeing a bit of kind of more high-tech solutions to kind of help policymakers and other stakeholders understand and track where to make these kind of investments in the urban kind of green environment. So there's a team of researchers from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. They created a machine learning model that kind of looks at freely available street view images to provide a kind of almost real-time updates on how much greenery exists and where it's vanishing fastest. And then finally in the UK, where a lot of ED listeners are based, one of the biggest climate challenges is surface water flooding, and so that's rather than flooding that's caused by the rivers or by the sea, it's a type of flooding that occurs when very intense rainfall causes runoff, and it's really particularly hard to forecast. So in the UK there is a startup called Provisico that is really leading in forecasting this type of flooding for a range of flood sensitive industries. You can think of like construction sites or car dealerships, and also insurance companies as well, and it continually generates these kind of insights at the level of individual properties, so you can kind of assess risk and take preventative action better. And then finally, another really cool one in space is a company called OpenStead. So what they do is they quantify the risk of flooding across a property portfolio and then identify opportunities to use underutilized space within that portfolio to implement kind of nature-based flood prevention methods. So those are kind of 3 that I would pick out. I mean, there's a lot of different angles you could take on this. There's a lot of different types of challenges depending on where you are in the world, but those are ones where we've seen quite a few of the innovations coming into our database.
I feel we need to get the flooding experts down to East Grinstead, because when I went out at lunch today, it was like surface water runoff. I've got wet socks from it kind of like going into my shoes now, and it's very uncomfortable. So yes,
that's not air cooling. Like, it's so interesting to hear, because every time I'm back in Delhi, it makes me physically anxious how much people run their air conditioners, like Absolutely. How often and for how long. But it was really interesting because last year when I was in Delhi, we heard of like a couple of our family friends, their accounts actually caught fire because the excessive running and the heat outside. And it's just like then future proofing the tech, but then also like the homes, just it's more and more complicated. It's only getting more complex, I think.
Exactly, it's a really tricky one as well because who are we to deny the effect of cooling on people who haven't had it before, when when they're starting for the first time to have the ability to do it, to install it. So I think those kind of cooling solutions are really important, and sometimes gets kind of a bit lost in kind of everything AI that we hear at the moment, so it's an important one to keep track of.
Yeah, see, I thought you were going to be talking all about sea walls and mangroves, but I'm clearly a little bit out of date.
Well, I could equally have talked about that. Yeah, no, I mean, like I said, it really does depend on where you are, the kind of solutions we're seeing, but those are some of the ones we're seeing.
I did ask Matilda this when she came on, and so I'll ask you as well, which is, what is your favourite innovation?
I really like the kind of the ones that combine biology and circular economy especially. So there's a company called Mycocycle who they basically use fungi, especially selected fungi, to recycle or upcycle construction waste. And I got a chance to speak to them actually at Change Now this year. I just think nature's so ingenious at coming up with solutions to things.
This is a tangent, but I saw a really cool video of a fungi, and they had attached like sensors to it, something, and they could understand like vibrations coming out of the fungi, and it was creating music.
Really?
It was creating patterns, and it wasn't so cool.
Yeah, I feel like I often end up talking about fungi. yeah.
I feel like if you tune in 5 years, it would just be the trees and the mushrooms chatting to each other, and we'll be obsolete.
Groot.
We'll have Groot instead. I need to move on now swiftly with an unceremonious segue to our fantastic guest speaker for today. So we've really zoomed in there on basically like specific rainy days or even single trees on a street. But I focused our special guest interview today on essentially looking at systemic and cascading risks. So basically, how can people across the world, whether that's your national governments, your cities, your businesses, get better at understanding sort of knock-on climate risk impacts and how they can go across different kinds of infrastructure and different kinds of sectors. So the expert that I spoke to about this was Ajam Gambhir. He is from the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment, ASRA for short. And as you can imagine, with that sort of mission, COP is a crucial moment in the calendar for them. And AJ himself was fascinating to talk to because he's not only doing this on a global scale now, but he has a wealth of experience in modelling and forecasting for the UK as well. So he worked on climate for 17 years within the UK government and then at Imperial in London. He played a key role in designing the UK's Climate Change Act 2008. So it was great to be tapping into some of his wealth of knowledge in this episode. Here's that interview with AJ in full. Thank you so much for taking the time. How have you been?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sarah, for having me. I'm very well, thank you. Looking forward to the next 2 weeks, which I'm sure will be very eventful in Belém.
Of course, and it'd be great for the benefit of the listeners to have, I think, a brief introduction to ASRA and how it's typically involved in COPs.
Yeah, so we're not very old, actually, ASRA. We've been around for about 2.5 years. We were an initiative from a few years ago to try to address what's called systemic risk, and that's the types of risks that interact with each other. So risks that happen at the same time. Think maybe COVID from a few years ago happening at the same time as raging wildfires, or perhaps even Black Lives Matter protests happening in the US. Lots of things going on at the same time. And then the other aspect of systemic risk is cascading risks. So one thing leading to another. And I'm sure that listeners will be very familiar with that in terms of climate change. It might be that heat waves lead to crop failures, which then lead to social unrest and all of the other economic and societal implications of that. So that's systemic risk. It's very wide-ranging and all-encompassing, and it was realised that there needed to be some body or institution out there that's thinking about this, and that's why ASRA, the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment, was set up.
Great. And how do you typically get involved with a COP? Is this a really big moment in the calendar for the team?
It's an important moment for ASRA. We haven't been deeply involved in the COPs that have happened since our foundation a couple of years ago, but this one promises to be an important one for a number of different reasons. I'm sure that we'll get into them, but resilience and adaptation are particularly important here, as is nature. This is the Amazon COP, isn't it? And there's a lot on the table about forestry and protecting ecosystems, and that's really central to how ASRA thinks about systemic risk. It thinks about human societies not as separate from the environment, but as deeply embedded within and part of the environment. So it's of particular interest to us.
Got it. And when you look at sort of the outcomes and the agreements from COPs past, the focus has very much been on mitigation rather than adaptation historically. But as you say, more and more people are seeming to think about this, at least at a top line level. So how hopeful are you about adaptation at COP this year, whether that's in the official text or whether there's some sort of side agreement or side initiative?
I am very hopeful that there'll be much more focus on adaptation. I think there are a few things to say about that. It's great that it's being understood how important adaptation is. There's been analysis from a few years ago that the economic benefits of adaptation might outweigh the costs of spending on adaptation by a factor of 10 to 1. So it's hugely important to invest in adaptation, whether that's in terms of creating new opportunities for employment, whether that's in terms of protecting ecosystems, whether that's purely in terms of just avoiding the damages of climate change. So that's all really good. What's a bit of a worry is first how long it's taken for the international community to understand the importance of adaptation. I think, as you implied in your question, there's been so much focus on mitigation, hasn't there, throughout the whole COP process since its inception, whether that's through the Kyoto Protocol emissions reduction targets or the Paris Agreement's nationally determined contributions and long-term temperature goal. But we should have really been focusing on adaptation right from the word go. Some places have been to an extent, but there's a huge funding gap there and a huge action gap there. And it should have always been an equal priority with mitigation. The two things don't trade off against each other, they go hand in hand. So to some extent, yes, it's great that there's this increasing focus on adaptation. I really hope that it's name checked in the text and that there's some firm funding commitment behind it. But it's a bit of a frustration that it's taken so long, and there definitely is a sense that we've blown the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees target and now we have to adapt. It really isn't like that at all. Mitigation and adaptation are equally important in terms of tackling this huge challenge of climate change.
Yeah, I've seen that as well, that sort of pitting the two against each other and arguing where to go. But the reality is that we've been moving too slowly on both. And you mentioned the massive finance gap here for adaptation. So the UN put new figures out on this earlier this month or very late October. It said that there was just 26 billion US dollars of public finance provided for adaptation in 2023, and that actually went down slightly year on year, even though, as you say, people know the improving returns. There's more data on that than ever before. There's more sort of focus than ever before. So what needs to happen now to really unlock that additional finance, AJ?
It's such a complicated question. There are different ways of answering it. There have been all sorts of processes to think about ingenious funding models, whether that's about increasing public finance or whether it's through blended finance, public-private finance, trying to find ways of monetizing that return. We know that in real world terms, the return on investment of adaptation is just less harm, less suffering, less destruction of ecosystems and societies and lives. But monetizing that seems to have proven a challenge. So I think one way of answering it is to say, yes, we need more ingenious funding models that give dollar signs more prominently to private investors. But a more simple way is I think we need a shift in mental models, and we need to understand that The world constantly needs to renew its infrastructure, its housing, its buildings, and the only way that we should be doing that is in an adaptation smart way. It's in a way which is cognizant of the damages that could come to infrastructure, to buildings, to farmland, to forests, and so on from this increasingly warming climate. So I don't know exactly how one gets that shift in mental models. We're seeing a little bit of that. We're seeing, going back to that last question, this inevitable focus on adaptation now that the world is incontrovertibly becoming warmer and climate extremes becoming more frequent and more severe. I think to some extent it's that feeling of this risk that's going to make the adaptation agenda more prominent. So maybe some new innovative finance instruments, but hopefully just a realization that this is the only way to go in terms of ongoing sustainable development.
It did seem to me that there was this sort of moment at the 27th COP. So this was Egypt 2022. So beyond the top line finance levels, most countries committed to a 30-step adaptation agenda, and some of the outcomes there include better access to early warning systems and making key infrastructure systems like water more resilient. So when we're looking sort of beyond the finance and to what's going on the ground and how people are living their lives and their livelihoods in the most impacted regions, what are you at ASRA seeing in terms of what have been some successes in recent years and what's really still on the horizon that we need to tackle?
There have been some successes, that's right. And we've seen a lot of progress on early warning systems that you mentioned, early warnings for all. And actually, I was at a conference last week for a few days. It was the EU Science for Preparedness conference, and it was astonishing how much was going on in terms of marrying up satellite Earth observation data with on-the-ground data and getting some real granularity and real detail in terms of what the changes are so that we can foresee with greater foresight and greater precision the kinds of damages that could be on the way. Clearly, artificial intelligence was a huge part of that as well, and that was probably the most mentioned term. We know that artificial intelligence comes with risks, but also huge opportunities in terms of being able to join up the dots that maybe we don't even see with our own eyes, but that can indicate to us the kinds of things that might be on the way. So that's all been hugely encouraging in terms of early warnings, and I think it's a good sign that we are starting to take foresight and think about what's on the way around the corner a bit more seriously. So definitely a big win. But in terms of just the sheer numbers, it can sometimes seem really intimidating what the adaptation gap is. It's something like, at latest estimates, $250 billion. And we can think to ourselves, well, how are we ever going to raise $250 billion? It's worth remembering what the global GDP figure at the moment is. It's $120 trillion. So we're talking about a very, very small percentage of the total product of what all of our activities, our services, our industries produce every year. And it does seem, from a macro perspective, really confusing that we just don't, as a global society, seem prepared to spend on this. So certainly we're understanding what's on the way in terms of early warnings, but we need to now step up and spend the requisite amount of money and resources to respond to those early warnings.
Yeah, and you mentioned something that I really did want to come on to, which is how things can get so confusing and so overwhelming when you just look at them in the macro, in the global picture, in terms of the billions or even trillions. So a lot of our listeners are going to be from the private sector and probably feeling some of those feelings when they're following along with the COP. So for people that are listening, how can they become better at embedding considerations of climate risks in their decision making and get to that point that you mentioned at the start, AJ, when you're considering risks systemically and looking at cascading, the chance of cascading impacts as well?
Yeah, it's a really fundamental question, Sarah. And I think it's a lot about everyone, no matter what they're doing. So whichever part of the private sector they're working in, whether they're working in producing some kind of product for consumption, which isn't necessarily anything to do with the climate on first analysis. It's about thinking, well, how does that live in a world which is warming and which is becoming environmentally and socially degraded, and just continuing to keep taking a step back and thinking, how does what my company is doing contribute to or detract from the problem of climate change? And then thinking, how can my business activities be changed, or how can I offset the damaging impacts, or how can I promote and accelerate the regenerative impacts of my business so that they can contribute to this? It's difficult for someone like me who's been working on climate change for best part of 20 years to see anything outside of the lens of climate change. All business activity, all private sector activity is underwritten by and can only happen because of the benign environment that our planet gives to us. And so it feels as though a natural extension of that is to think about whatever you're doing as either contributing to that environment or detracting from it. So I know that that's a bit of a kind of hypothetical answer, but I think it's not too difficult to just telescope out from what you're doing and think, that this is intimately connected to the state of our environment and the state of our planet at this time.
I was speaking to someone else who works in risk a few weeks ago, and he said something that stuck with me, which is that data from the past is just becoming increasingly bad at predicting the future. So you're saying if you don't put yourself in that sort of context, you're going to miss the trick, basically.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that speaks to this whole notion of, it sounds a bit sounds a bit scientific and mathematical, but this whole notion of non-linearities and breakpoints, and the general notion that if you extrapolate from past evidence, something similar or incrementally different will happen in the future. I think we no longer have that luxury. We've seen decades of socioeconomic development and environmental degradation, and we know that tipping points are now on the horizon. There was the Global Tipping Points report, the second one that was published just a few weeks ago. I was involved in that personally, and a number of ASRA network members were also involved in that. There's a lot of activity on the Global Tipping Points report happening in Belém over the next 2 or 3 days, and I think that's going to really underscore that as we get higher and higher temperatures, we get into that danger zone of tipping points, like, for example, the Amazon dying back and starting to emit more carbon than it takes up from the atmosphere. Those sorts of things are potentially on their way. They're not things that you can just understand through extrapolating trends from the past, because they haven't happened at that sort of scale and speed before. So we need to use a lot of imagination, a lot of analysis, and be very pluralistic in terms of the types of perspectives that we take about all of the possibilities that could happen in the future. That's very, very important at this stage of the game.
And to be honest, I could stay on for another 20 minutes or so and just talk to you about tipping points, AJ, but that's all the time we've unfortunately got for this particular discussion. So thank you so much for taking the time out at what I know is a super busy time for all things adaptation. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks very much, Sarah. It was good to be on.
Thanks once again to AJ for his time. That's almost all the time we have for today, but there will doubtless be some big news out of Belém overnight, which we will bring you in written form on the EDie website, and then we'll recap in brief on tomorrow's episode. And our focus for tomorrow's episode is the circular economy. I think Siddy's doing our guest interview tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm speaking to Michael from the Circularity Initiative, and we'll probably talking about the aftermath since the plastic negotiation earlier this year kind of fell apart, and nothing really came out of it. So yeah, and I can see more and more people interlinking climate action with action on plastic as well, and how both those different problems are so interrelated. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. It'll be really interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to listening to it, which I will be doing because it's the first Tuesday in 12 weeks with no Great British Bake Off. So quite frankly, what else are you meant to do with your evening? But in the meantime, you can check out all of our written COP coverage on edie.net, and Matthew Springwise also has a cool COP feature out, don't they? I've had a look at this one.
Yeah, absolutely. We this is on our springwise.com blog area of our site, and what I tried to do was, without being too negative, take a look back at what has changed in the 10 years since the Paris Agreement in terms of climate innovation. And I think it was actually, whilst we're very short of where we need to be, it is useful to remember that stuff has changed, because I think it's very paralysing to think that nothing changes ever. So we looked at some of the things like, the amount of solar power installed capacity, like the huge increases we've seen in that, and also the huge falls in the cost of it. I mean, obviously a lot has changed in terms of AI since then, going more mainstream. It was an interesting piece to put together. It's sort of trying to strike the balance between sort of helpful optimism, but also not kind of say we're further ahead than we are, but reminding us that actually stuff that, if we weren't behind the climate clock, would be considered pretty extraordinary, has happened in the last 10 years.
Yeah, really interesting feature, so do go and check that out. But for today's episode, that really is everything. So it's a goodbye from Matt.
Goodbye.
A goodbye from Siddy.
Goodbye.
A goodbye from Matthew.
Goodbye.
And goodbye from me. Goodbye.